You're listening to the Penteract Poetry Podcast, hosted by Anthony Etherin.
Welcome to episode 21 of the Penteract Poetry Podcast. My guest this time is visual poet and poem atlas curator Astra Papachristodoulou. I met up with Astra a couple of weeks ago to discuss her work and began by asking what first led her to poetry.
So I come from a working class family. No one was, professional per se, or went to university or anything like that. So I didn't even think about poetry when I was young, to be honest with you. One thing that I was introduced to in my family was painting. My dad would paint in his spare time, sadly not professionally, because he's quite talented actually. But growing up, so it was me, my sisters and my dad. Me and my sisters were really involved with music. So we all played musical instruments, different each, and we would kind of have a little orchestra and put together theatre plays. And sometimes we would take my dad's painting brushes and things like that when he was away. And I did destroy one of his pieces once by mistake. I thought, painting Minnie Mouse was the masterpiece at the time. And so I've always had a creative drive. I was curious about different things, but I didn't really know how to channel it. And in my early 20s, so I went for a BA in theatre studies. So I moved from Greece when I was about 17, or from Greece to England to study theatre studies. Still, it didn't quite click with me. So although I really enjoyed theatre and I was passionate for it, something just didn't click for me. And then a few years passed where I tried painting, some singing, and came to a point in my early 20s where I was really depressed. And it was the very bottom for me. And one night, I remember I just didn't sleep at all. And, it was a very melancholic night for me. And I had just done this painting of a woman that was wounded, and it was quite horrific. And I thought, well, why don't I pair this painting with some writing? So I didn't think, of poetry as form at the time. I just thought I'll write some words down. And it ended up being a poem about a volcano that was active, but it was sort of bubbling and about to erupt. Kind of, as a metaphor, obviously, for my emotions at the time. Very cheesy, I know. So after that poem, I quite enjoyed the process, and it helped me, with dealing with some really difficult emotions at the time. And then it was at the very start that I started, Googling, the word poetry, fun poetry, creative poetry, things like that. And I stumbled across some concrete poems. I think there was, the ones that are shaped as animals, quite basic concrete poems.
Yeah.
And that my curiosity just sparkled at that moment. And first poem I actually published was a concrete poem at Street Cake. I think it was 2015 or early 2016 or something like that. And it was a concrete poem in the shape of the sun. And so, yeah, I didn't quite know that things were going to unfold the way they did. And it's quite an understatement to say that poetry completely transformed my life from doing lots of odd jobs that I absolutely hated, from not knowing people that were similar to me at the time, friends that would appreciate the same things and would have similar interests to mine. So visual poetry really filled that void in my life. And, at the moment doing a PhD in material poetics, and I mean, I don't know, it's quite amazing to see how the that one night of just grabbing a piece of paper and just writing down a few things kind of transformed my life so much. So that was the hopefully that wasn't too long.
No, not
the
at all.
answer.
No, and two things really stand out from that. Firstly, it seems like you've always had this multidiscipline, multifaceted artistic worldview, that you've tried everything. And I know you still do lots of performance-based things, and you've done film poems. And the other thing that stands out is that, and I'm very interested in, is that you did start with what would be considered very traditional visual poetry, calligrams, the pattern poems.
Yeah.
But you've gone from that to really pushing it as far as you can with the object poems idea, which are just some of the most beautiful works I've seen in recent years.
Oh, thank you so much.
Would you like to describe what an object poem is?
Yeah, so an object poem, so it's a tactile poem, something you can hold, a bit like a visual poem. It's a confluence of form and content. The advantage I think that I see in object poetry is the interactivity, that interactive aspect within the object poem. And also I think because we live in I know it sounds a bit cliche, but we live in a digital world where the tangible is often taken from us, and quite literally in our own communication as well. I like that form because it often plays in the handcrafted as well. So it often involves some sort of craft and skill. And also, I think it has the advantage of being presented in its own environment. Whereas I think with a page, you're often quite limited as to how much you can curate the world around a poem. Whereas with an object poem, you can, apart from a gallery space, which can be obviously arranged to create a certain aesthetic to go with a poem, you can, I recently, I've been working on this film poem in which I'm deep in the poems made of the sculptures into water. One of my ideas, which I hope to materialize soon, is to have an exhibition of object poems underwater in a quiet beach in Greece, a rocky beach, where I can sort of hide those bioresin poems underneath rocks and have a little map where the participants can take goggles and go and look for them. And the idea of having the fish kind of interacting with those forms. I mean, it's something that you can't always portray in a two-dimensional way on the page. So it's really exciting for me. Hence why I created Poem Atlas about a year and a half or so back.
Yeah, well, we should talk about that. So Poem Atlas it's you're the curator. You call yourself rather than an editor. You happy with that? So yeah, would you like to describe it?
Yeah, so Poem Atlas is an object poetry platform, although I don't always restrict it to object poetry, because I want to include, I think Poem Atlas is about community and just bringing people together, particularly in visual poetry. So I don't always restrict it to object poetry, because I want to include all sorts of visual poets, give them a voice. So it's a platform that curates online and physical exhibitions. Often, I'm hoping to produce. So I've got a few plans in the months ahead, where the exhibitions are going to be accompanied with an exhibition catalog, a printed version. so that people that can't, so that I suppose you anthologize the physical exhibitions, and also, I suppose a lot of us really like the book form as well, and there's something quite beautiful on having flicking the pages of a visual poetry book, and also reaching as many people as possible. So that's something that I'm looking to do with Poem Atlas in the following months. And yeah, I think the sense of community that I mentioned earlier is my main goal. And that's something that really came through in the first physical exhibitions that we did, aka me. So at the very first one was at the Westminster Reference Library in Trafalgar Square. Another one was at the Poetry Society, at the Poetry Cafe, the gallery space. And in addition to the exhibition element, I'm quite keen on the performativity of visual poems. And so a lot of the poems that the poets that performed in the launches added a beautiful, different dimension to the objects. So it is, I suppose it does involve performance as well, but that sense of community really came through the events. And the most precious time was really the, aftermath, where for me, when the event was over and you could see everyone being really happy and wanted to connect with each other, having a drink, and then, exchanging their details. And so it's that hopefully a foundation for visual poets to connect.
Yeah, when I started this podcast just over a year ago, I made a list of questions, like generic questions I want to ask people. And one of them was, how do you promote poetry? Because it's quite a difficult thing to do. And I wanted to talk about book readings and performances and all these things. And then I didn't know that about a month after starting this podcast, the world would suddenly be plunged into this situation where you can't do any of those things.
I know.
But I know that you've done some exhibitions online over the last year. I mean, how have you found adapting to this strange situation?
Well, it's quite funny because I started the first online exhibition that I did was shortly a few months before the COVID pandemic. So it was in December 2019 that I started it. So it was something that I had in mind before this whole thing. Well, the first one, I think we had about I selected about 7 pieces, so it wasn't a massive online exhibition, but it did become apparent with COVID, the need to move some of the work online, and the response was really great. I think as soon as if I remember well, don't quote me on the dates, but it was shortly after the first lockdown that I put together Isolate Zone, which was about self-isolation, and then the following one was themed around I should know that. So it was that self-isolation and escapism. And particularly those ones had a really great response. So from having about 200 visitors on the first exhibition, we went something that I monitor through Google Analytics. We went to like over 1,000 visitors, which was really amazing to see the audience, rising so much. So although at the very start, when I started putting plans together for Poem Atlas, I was quite keen to focus. So although I did have online exhibitions in mind, the focus was going to be on physical exhibitions. Now it sort of feels like the online exhibitions are quite as important. And for the reason that some really, really talented poets submitted from Canada, for example, Derek, of course, Amanda Earl, people that I wouldn't usually be able to include so easily in physical exhibitions, mainly because of the transportation of the poems and the costs, and so, and I can see how, you guys have adapted really well in it through your various ventures. And I think I was quite glad. I think although lockdown has been horrible, it has had its positives and kind of pressuring you to sort of look at different ways to engage with people. And those online exhibitions were one of those ways.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we'd already decided to do the podcast before the pandemic.
Yeah, of course.
Largely because you live in London. You're lucky. You've always got something to do. We live out in the countryside, and there's too much to do here, and it's an expense to travel to cities. So we'd already decided that we needed to do a lot of online things. Yeah. And then the pandemic's just kind of accelerated that.
Yeah, it's put a lot of things into perspective, the pandemic, definitely.
Yeah. And another thing was, it just by chance or whatever circumstances, we ended up knowing a lot of poets from outside the UK before we really got to know UK poets. Made friends with a lot of Canadians, again, like you mentioned. It's always the Canadians.
Exactly.
The Canadian avant-garde is something quite spectacular.
Yes. No, it's amazing because I know that a lot of your authors, although a lot of press is focused on the UK kind of base, I have noticed that you guys are really reaching out far, which is a great thing to see.
Yeah, as you are. And I think it's one of the, I suppose it's a consequence of a relatively little known art form, or underappreciated art form, that you do have to cast the net wider.
Definitely. And I think it's because, when the net is casted wider from, the other side towards you, I mean, it's a really wonderful thing, because I've had people to reach out to me from different countries, for festivals or, anthology opportunities. And it's a really wonderful feeling to connect with others and, make friends from different countries. So that's why I try to sort of not pay them back, but, it's all about collaboration and creating friendships, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk a bit about visual poetry. I mean, if that's how you now mostly define yourself, or do you just see yourself as an artist of many different talents?
No, I think I do consider myself as a visual poet a bit more than, say, an artist or poet. And yeah, it's quite hard to sometimes define yourself, especially with disciplines like visual poetry, where the boundaries are so kind of faded away, if that makes sense. It's quite easy to jump through visual poetry to play with other disciplines, as you mentioned before, with film or with sculpture or with performance. There's loads of things that involve this term. But that's my preferred, I suppose. as it's just something that I'm really interested at the moment and have been for quite a while now, and I think I will be in the future.
But you're interested in lots of things, and you seem to work really hard on this. Whereas it's probably, I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but it's probably quite easy to be lazy and just stick to one aspect. You must have taught yourself a lot of things. I have your website up actually here with all the object poems. There's real technique there. You must have had to learn a lot of new skills to make some of these.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I've had a lot of failed attempts with things. Like one of the most challenging skill to develop was working with bioresin. So I only tried it to start with, to be perfectly honest with you, because I wouldn't at first. So I had considered working with it for a few years, but I've always found it a really expensive material to work with. And that always put me off, because I mean, a small bottle is about 30 quid and it doesn't go so far. But I had won an art competition a few years back, and they sent me as a reward a full box, with different art materials. And I didn't realize that resin was one of the things in that box. And one time I was sitting around and going through all the arts materials, just trying to find something new to play with. And I came across the resin. I had 2 bottles in there, which were quite large, thankfully. The first one went completely to waste because I didn't have the patience at all to follow the instructions. And with resin, you have to be really, really careful with the measurement. There's a real technique on how you stir it, how long you stir it for, what sort of, it's really sticky, it's really horrible, and it can get ruined very easily. And so the first bottle I completely destroyed, and then I started going somewhere with the second pot, but it took me quite a few bottles to kind of get the hang of it. Thankfully, the university, I was able to claim some of the materials through the university, and otherwise, I don't think I would have devoted so much time into it. And then eventually, obviously, when I started seeing what I thought, sometimes when you create something, let's be honest, you do have an understanding of what works and what doesn't. Because, I know a lot of the times people are quite hesitant to say, you know what, I've created this and I love it. Because, they don't want to come across as arrogant but I'm sure that everyone deep inside, when we create something, we have an awareness of what has worked and, what could be worked a bit better. And a few bottles of resin later, I was getting somewhere. And I always want to take it a step further. And then as soon as I kind of perfected the basic form, then I started incorporating other materials with it. Like metal or cellulose acetate. I've put copper in there, wood, a lot of wood. Recently, I've put in, I don't know if you've seen this one. It might be in the book that we're going to publish together in October. But I've put a dragonfly in it, a dead dragonfly. So... And it's a wonderful material because of its transparency, the translucency, the sculptural aspect that it adds. So, I think now I sort of forgot the question, where we started with this, but was it experimentation, if I remember well?
The learning of new skills.
Yes.
Because if you're going to use lots of different materials, as you do, then you've got to be competent at manipulating them. So there's a lot of work. It seems to me there's a lot of work that goes into it. I wouldn't know personally. I just use pen and paper. I'm
No,
I'm
great
lazy.
is great. No, you're not. But I mean, through visual poetry, it's the object poetry. If you're adventurous enough, you can develop so many skills. I mean, I didn't know how to use a saw before, an electric one as well. So I'm quite hands-on. I've played with concrete before, nearly cut my hands on a wood cutting machine, fabric. So as soon as you've got, the passion for it and the curiosity, there's always new skills to learn.
I suppose that's true of any art, isn't it? When you have an idea, you can almost get annoyed with yourself because you think, I've had this idea, now I've got to do it. But it's going to be so much hard work. But I like the idea so much, I've got to see it through.
Exactly.
So I'm just, I've got your website up now. And these object poems are all so amazing.
Thank you.
So the one glacial, what's going on there?
So that one was the first to follow of a series of similar sculptures. The text comes from Zaha Hadid's website. So I'm a big fan of Zaha Hadid. And one time I was just scrolling through her, I think it was the design work that she did before she died, obviously. And I just noticed some really amazing titles in there. Some quite poetic, abstract, quite futuristic titles in there describing her pieces. And I thought, actually, this might make a poem themselves. So I just took a pen and paper and just wrote down all the works of Zaha Hadid that were on the website that interested me and had a nice sort of resonance. I then arranged them alphabetically, and I sort of played around with different forms that would work with that quite rigid alphabetical arrangement. I thought that the wave and the translucency of the bioresin would quite help frame some of these words that a lot of them were, one of them glacial, which is the title of my piece. I found that they were quite nicely framed around the idea of an ice mountain, of a sort of glacial form. And so I thought that the form of the standing form, the curved shape, and the translucency of the resin would then help enhance that meaning that could come through the words. And some of the words, I mean, I don't have the poem in front of me, and I put away the sculpture, but if I remember well, you have quite a lot of abstract, unfamiliar words like serac, or well, I think it would help. Maybe I should open it up.
Mercuric. I can see something.
Yes.
Mercuric.
Yeah, mercuric. I think there is it etheric? So I think words that are quite flexible and are quite unfamiliar to us, words that we don't use always in our day-to-day conversation. So I thought that because of that unfamiliarity of some of the words, they would help then give context to that idea of the glacial that I then built in my mind, following the assemblage of the words from Zaha Hadid's website. So yeah, that's the idea behind glacial.
And aside from the idea, it's just such a beautiful looking object. I could talk about all of these.
Oh,
but I'll just pick a couple more. The Jenga ones fascinate me because I think of the potential with constraints there.
Yes, the Jenga piece came. So it was commissioned from Stephen Fowler for a literary event that was an event themed around Attila József, which is a Hungarian poet. And how this came to mind was that, so the performance was nearing, I didn't put anything together, and I remember just going through all the objects in my house. I just couldn't find anything. Sometimes when you just get, do they call it a writer's block, or am I just being totally Greek? Yeah. And yep. So
writer's block, not Jenga block.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Although in this context, yes, Jenga block. But I remember just trying to think of something for the performance that I had to prepare for that event. I couldn't find anything, and so I often go to charity shops, and because they have a lot of interesting objects there to find that you're able to then transform into object poems. Took them all one by one, couldn't find anything, and I ended up, I think it was like W.H. Smith's, where they had a lot of board games on offer, and it was love at first sight. When I saw this Jenga, box Jenga looking at me, I thought, right, this is it. So I took it home, took lines from Attila József's poetry, I think it was, if I remember well, it was one word in each block. It was a black version, which is not on the website at the moment. I don't think so. And then that was the first versions. Then another version was then created for the Poetry Cafe, and it's there. If when it reopens, you can go there and play. It's usually right at the front of the till. You can go take it with your friends and play with it. And then Stephen Emerson, a few months later, was very kind to publish a limited edition of 20 mini, really tiny poetry jengas. So he published them through A Talks, which is a publisher of object poetry. And although that was a pain to make, those, because each of them had to be handcrafted, so I just remember my hands just hurting so much, too much sanding. This was a nightmare. That was the worst project. But so the way that this project unfolded was that it came from a handwritten, taking different forms. So from I've done the black one, then a wooden effect, the natural wooden effect with handwritten ones, and then the one that I produced for A Talks was with transferred ink letters, transferred and then sealed onto wood. But it's one of my favorites because everyone knows Jenga, and everyone has happy childhood memories with Jengas. Hopefully no one was brought up in a home where they would just chuck poetry Jengas on their head or anything like that. So I think it's something that it's quite a simple idea that non-poetry audiences are quite drawn into. And I think that's also apart from that poetry Jenga, I think in terms of object poetry in general, that's the advantage with it. Well, from my experience was that whenever I've been in a book fair or somewhere where I've got objects with me to show, it feels like people are their first reaction is to investigate what's going on, to touch, to pick it up, touch it, to play with it. And I think that there's something quite inviting and engaging with something tangible that you can hold at the palm of your hands, as opposed to a page poem. But that doesn't mean that obviously page poems they can't be engaging, and interesting and exciting. It's just that tangible dimension, that tactile dimension that gives the object poems their advantage to non-poetry audiences, I suppose, that might be familiar with the form that the object poem has.
Yeah, we're in an art form that doesn't have a huge audience, and we need to find ways to get people involved. And this idea of the interactive poem is very interesting. And I think, why not combine it with a game?
Exactly, and why not have some fun?
So you can do a reading now if you're up for it.
Yeah, of course.
You wanted to read a poem called Cyclonic. This is from a project called Elements.
Yeah, so Elements is basically the sequence of those wavy sculpture poems that, so we talked about glacial earlier, which was part of this Elements sequence. And we're at the moment, we're in conversation with Derek Beaulieu, which is going to publish it through No Press in the future, which is great news because, as I've said before, I really admire his work. So Cyclonic is the one I thought I might read to you. So it's a version of glacial, with the difference that rather than focusing on water and ice, it focuses on the wind and the immaterial. So although it's a material poem, it plays with the idea of immateriality. I suppose in terms of its content and its core includes a steel mesh. So that's shall I start?
Yes,
You can cut
please.
that later. Cyclonic, anabatic, animus, anticyclonic, asomatus, aswaj, austere, atmospheric, auric, billow, boreas, brisk, brumous, chilling, coastal, cyclonic, draft, drift, eldritch wind, Elysian, ephemeral, epochal, Etesian, ether, eurus, flowy, fluctuating, fluent, freshet, fuging, funneling, gradient, horizontal, hueless, immaterial, incorporeal, ionic, katabatic, lacustrine, maritime, meltemic, mistral noir, moving, naval, nitrous, northerly, nodal, Newman, onshore, oscillatory, oxygenous, perforated, prevailing, prismatic, rural, sandstorm, shifting, shivering, siroc, skyron, sonorous, soothing, spectral, streaming, subfasc, sweeping, swift, tidal, tropical, turbulent, unquiet, waver, westerly, windward, wintry, wreathen, yielding, zephyrus.
Thank you. And I owe you an
Pleasure.
apology, actually. Apologies. I should have asked you to read that after talking about glacial, but I just got carried away by Jenga. And
Yeah, of course.
because in preparation for this interview, as I always do, I looked up things we could talk about, and there are so many, and I definitely didn't want to miss Jenga out.
Thank you. Yes, of course.
Yeah, I'm going to include a link to your website in the description to this podcast because I want people to go and see these object poems and indeed everything else on your site. I watched some of your film poems as well, and they're amazing too.
Thank you.
So we've got lots to talk about still.
Definitely.
If we can go back to when you said that you started out with calligrams and simple pattern poems. What are your feelings on the relationship between innovative experimental visual poetry and traditional visual poetry? Do you ever revisit the more traditional forms, or are you now focused on looking forward, looking ahead to new things?
No, I certainly am. I mean, I'm very much inspired by traditional visual poetry as well, and I quite like all of its strands, really. From concrete to the typographical poems, and so I find inspiration in all of the visual poetry forms. Well, at least all those that I know, because I don't know everything, but I don't know how relevant it's going to be, and I don't know, maybe my answer is a bit all over the place right now, but I'm taking Stephen Fowler's course soon on visual poetry, and I'm quite excited to learning a bit more on the history of visual poetry, because it's just something that I think it's quite nice to know the basis of something to be able to then move forward.
Yeah, and Stephen is very knowledgeable about this. He's been on the podcast a couple of times.
Exactly.
Because in my own practice, I do find these two urges. One is to go back and do something traditional, and the other is to do something no one's ever done before. And I sort of flip between those two states. And I genuinely think it's important to be focused on both. I suppose in much the same way that you get a really good feeling when you've done something no one's done before, but you also get a really good feeling when you've mastered something that's existed for centuries.
Definitely. And I think it's quite nice to also acknowledge the people in the field, as a contemporary, because I suppose I don't think obviously nothing exists without its past. So it's nice to acknowledge the people who provided the basis of visual poetry.
Do you consider yourself a futurist? It's a word that comes up a lot in your work.
Yes, not really. I think futurism is a dangerous word. Neo-futurist, I think through the research that I have done, I was a bit more skeptical to use it at first, only because it has created turbulence, let's say, in the past with a person that I worked with, who published a work of mine that was labeled as Neo-Futurist. And so this experience has sort of taught me to be quite careful. And to be fair, it was made me a bit more aware also of the negative associations of futurism. Not so much Neo-Futurism, only because, especially in poetry, it's pretty much non-existent as a form. There aren't really, apart from the White Manifesto in the 1960s, if I remember well, which emerged, I think, in Argentina, that there were some associations with the work that was published with Neo-Futurism. There isn't really someone else that identifies as such. So it's a hard one. I think
it's the general problem of labels, I think, isn't it?
Yes,
but one label can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
Yes, but I think particularly with futurism, because it was, it is associated with a lot of horrible things, with misogyny, with, terrible history surrounding fascism, particularly the involvement of the futurist leader, F.T. Marinetti, with fascism for a number of years. And also the leakage of the term futurism in Neo-Futurism, although they're two completely different movements with completely different people involved in each, sometimes protrudes to quite problematic assumptions of people. And a lot of the times, Neo-Futurism is considered as a new version of futurism, when really they are very different disciplines. But I have used the word Neo-Futurism a lot in the past, only because it's something that particularly Neo-Futurist architecture has played a very big influence in the work that I have produced. And so my poetry tries to often translate the Neo-Futurist aesthetic as I explore it in poetry, and of course, without taking on any of I think I'm sort of focusing more on the things that inspire me rather than what issues might surround the movement. But yeah, it's a very complex discussion, I think.
Yeah, and it's extremely difficult because the reason we use these labels is to make talking about things easier.
Yes.
And if you're following something for its aesthetics, it's quite useful to use that term. But of course, that term that might then be loaded with all this politics, which you want to avoid.
Yes.
It can get very messy.
Definitely, and I think that's why the experience I mentioned before. I think when I got introduced into futurism, it was all that creative energy, that drive that the futurists had, that really interested me, and it was that element that I focused on. And I think there's nothing wrong with taking the good things out of certain historical movements, people, etc. However, obviously, with having something historical loaded with so much negativity is a very tricky thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, this goes down to the level of the individual too. If someone's a bad person but they create good art,
Yes.
it's difficult. It's a difficult problem for people.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so I'll leave all the futurism stuff. Sorry.
No, of course not.
Going back to how to promote poetry, and of course now in the age of COVID, social media has become perhaps more important. What are your feelings towards it? Do you enjoy Twitter and Instagram and the like, or do you just find it too hostile and annoying?
Well, I don't know if it's a lockdown thing, but I used to have a really good relationship with it, with social media. Uh, Recently, it's got too dark. I feel like there is quite a lot of hostility, especially on Twitter, and I tend to stay out of trouble, post about my work, because this is the function that I want my accounts, Twitter and Instagram accounts to have, basically to just promote my work, share ideas, exchange a few nice comments with people from the visual poetry scene, and beyond. But yeah, I have found it quite difficult recently. There is a lot of negativity in there. So I try not to scroll down too much and just post my thing, like friends' posts, things that I enjoy, and then get out of here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's such a shame. I mean, Twitter's really done a lot for me. Just my constant posting of poems has been very good for me. But yeah, since the pandemic, it's not very pleasant being there a lot of the time. And I keep thinking about quitting, which is something I know I shouldn't do because it's still a very useful tool for me.
Yeah,
But it's just not as nice now. But things
definitely.
will change again, perhaps.
Yeah. It's just, I think that in the pod, you're going to get some really nice people, but there's a lot of negative people as well. And thankfully, I haven't been attacked or anything like this before, but I have seen friends being attacked before and having some really horrible things to deal with as a result of some of the interactions that they've had on social media. Therefore, why I try to keep it sweet and short. But yeah, hopefully things will change, and after COVID, it'll be a bit of a happy place. But it's not. It's never gonna be.
Yeah, it was never that
But
happy.
yeah, exactly. Like the world, I suppose, itself. But perhaps happier is the right word.
Yeah. So we should talk about what's upcoming for you. And I'm sure that's quite a lot of things. That obviously there's one in particular that I'd like to talk about. But in fact, I'm interested in everything else you're doing because I'm sure there's a long list.
Thank you. So first thing I should mention, of course, is my my book with Penteract Press, which is coming out in early October 2021. So please do keep an eye out. So inside Ocean Gross Time Capsule is as you know, but I'll just, for the sake of the podcast, tell you a bit more about it. So it's a book which is themed around futurity, discovery, archiving of work. There's a lot of ideas there. And they are framed around a series of visual poetry prompts, an essay written by two fictional curators of visual poetry in the 2100s, and then a glossary at the back, which gives context to this new setting within the book, in a world of robots and humans and how they coexist in the 2100s, but also how it gives you a glimpse into the abilities of robots themselves in the future, and focuses on the works of Ocean, who is a visual poet herself in the future, who has hidden all these poems in this time capsule, which is discovered. The story is unfolded in the first part. The essay is explored through the visual prompts at the core of the book, and then is explained a little bit more depth through a glossary. So it plays with a lot of different kind of non-traditional forms, and hopefully it will be something that visual poets will enjoy, because you don't really get books that with exercise for visual poets, I suppose. So
again, it's a great interactive aspect.
Yes, definitely. Hopefully, it will go beyond the visual poetry community, of course, and especially some young people that may be interested to find out more about visual poetry, as there isn't as much sort of educational type of books out there. Now, I'm not by any means saying that this is educational, but it could be used, to explore your creativity and then heighten your knowledge on visual poetry and all the different things that you can do with a pen and materials around you.
And is it Neo-Futurist? Should I mention Neo-Futurism again?
No, please do. To be fair, my PhD is on it, so something that I'm really interested in. I am being a bit careful, but I don't want this experience to kind of, scare me off from using the term.
Yeah,
nothing
absolutely
with
not.
it, Yeah. It does explores Neo-Futurism, yes, and I think it's in the essay as well. There is quite a lot of mention of Neo-Futurist architecture, which helps to build that aesthetic of how the future may look like, and also how far how robots will then be able to find a place in a world which is at the moment very human-centered.
And so what else is coming up for you then? Because you've got, I'm sure, lots of exhibitions.
Yes, so apart from the book with Penteract in October, I've got, so very shortly, I'm going to have an Easter themed book with KFS. It should be, I think, end of February that it's coming out. It's another collaboration with John Kilburn, who I've recently collaborated with for the first pamphlet of Poem Atlas, auditioning for Poem Atlas, which tells the story behind the logo of Poem Atlas. And so that book will have a lot of, playful illustrations, but very gruesome as well. It tells the story of three, it's in a children's storybook, but for adults. There's a lot of blood in there. It surrounds these three rabbits and their dad, who is taken by the forest by these evil scientists into a laboratory, a facility that tests beauty products and things like that. And they do some horrible things to the bunnies, but at the end, one of them may survive to tell the story. I'm not saying anymore. So
that sounds amazing.
Thank you. I'll send you a copy when it's out.
You keep sending me everything. I will have to pay for something at some point.
Honestly, don't worry. It's a gift. But apart from, so that's Bunnies Behind Bars. Then there is a collection with Guillermo Press, which will be out in 2022. If I remember well, it's end of March. And it's based on the 88 constellations. So it takes the form of each of the constellations, and it's got a lot of interactive poems inside as well, much like the Penteract pamphlet. So that's really exciting. And then a book with Stranger Press, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, which plays with, I don't know if you're a fan of Forensic Files. Do you know Forensic Files?
I don't.
But I mean, you have to watch it. It's pretty awesome. If you're a true crime fan, you will like it. It takes basically each episode. It's a TV show, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that. But it explores different crimes and shows the forensic aspect of it and how they use forensics to solve the crimes. So I've gone onto YouTube and picked a lot of crazy comments. I mean, there are, I think, over 400 episodes, and I watched, I promise you, every single of these episodes, and then extracted those, just a variety of comments, and then made poems out of them. And then, so that's the books. And then in terms of exhibitions, so there are two online exhibitions to look out for. One is an exhibition which I'm co-curating with Isabel Gallimore and Caroline Harris, and it's themed around cuteness. So we're going to have an online exhibition up on Poem Atlas with some really great contributors. I can't reveal names yet, but there are going to be some great people in it. And then an exhibition catalog in a printed form, which is going to be the first of its kind for Poem Atlas, because the last exhibition catalog we collaborated with another press to produce. So that's the first one with a proper Poem Atlas stamp on it. And then an online exhibition with co-curated with Paul Hawkins of Hester Clock Press and David Solo from New York. And that's for the Bristol Photo Festival, but that's another kind of Poem Atlas venture, and it's going to be themed around photo poetry. And then in September, very exciting, hopefully if everything goes to plan, a physical exhibition in Rhodes, where I'm from. That's the first time I'm gonna do anything in the island I'm from. So a physical exhibition of my own work, which is going to be themed around bees at the Rhodes Art Park Gallery. It's a gallery literally in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by beautiful nature. So it's going to be a great house for those eco poems, bee poems that I'm all sculptural that I'm working on at the moment. And then alongside the solo exhibition, I'm going to curate a group exhibition with some mostly UK visual poets who will contribute with poetry written on textiles. So that's pretty much it. I hope I didn't forget anything, but
that's already quite a lot.
Yes, thank you.
I like the idea of going to Rhodes. I need a holiday.
Oh, please do. And hopefully if I'm there, I can show you around. But yeah, let me know if you're going to Rhodes. I'll hit you up with a list of cool things to do there.
Well, I have to admit, I've never been to Greece, which is shameful.
Right now, I am holding my head with my hands. No. Well, hopefully, after this call, you might even look at this gallery that I told you about. You'll be mesmerized and persuaded, hopefully.
I'm sure that, yeah, of course. Well, Astra, it's been really lovely to meet you.
Same here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm so excited to probably be a part of the Penteract family soon.
To discover more, visit us at penteractpress.com.